Welcome back. This is Bent Discipline with Lesson 10 on becoming a better dominant. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the anatomy of a scene. Now, every scene is going to be completely different depending on who's doing it and what's happening within that scene, what type of submissive you have, what type of dominant you are, what you're trying to accomplish, your overall reaching goals. But this is just a rough guideline that I use, and I don't even use it in all scenes. It's just a rough guideline on how to structure a scene to have good flow. And the first thing is, I think of it kind of like a meal or like a novel. It has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So what I start off with is setting the scene, setting the pace. And the first thing is I make sure that in the protocols, there's an opportunity for them to transition from their day-to-day life into the scene. So there's some preparation that occurs prior to even showing up for the scene. When the scene is about to start, they have to be prepared by disrobing, by kneeling, by having themselves properly presented and prepared for the scene. So all of these things set up the scene in their mind, knowing that there is a transition from their day-to-day life to the experience that they're about to have. And then I allow them to sit or kneel in that experience for a little while so that they can soak it in and have a gradual transition into the scene. Now, the very first thing that I do is collaring. So I know that, so that they know that there's a major transition in their protocol. And it also is a trigger for them to realize that they're now about to enter subspace. They're now about to enter a real scene. So the collaring procedure, they're kneeling. I may just show them the collar. I may say, prepare for collaring. I may say, accept. There's many different ways of doing it. I put the collar on, and from that moment forward, the protocol changes into high protocol. And I'm not going to get into protocol right now. There's a lot of books on it, and I might go into it in a later chapter. Just know that there's a protocol change, and I may even test to make sure that they remember that there's been a protocol change. So the next thing I do is I have them inspected. I have them prepare for inspection, and there's different ways of doing that. They can be kneeling or standing. They put their hands clasped behind their back, and I inspect them from top to bottom very slowly, as if you were inspecting a beautiful car or an amazing object. You're looking for little details, and you want to reward them for what they've done correctly because you've asked them to prepare for the scene, and you want to remind them when they haven't done it correctly. And I'll get into that in greater detail after. So after inspection, there's a review of things that they've learned in the last scene or scenes. It could be things like verbal commands. It could be positions, or it could be anything that you've trained them to do to see how well they know it. Now, myself, especially with a new sub, I don't expect them to remember everything every time right away. If they've been doing something consistently for a while, they've learned, from that point forward, I expect them to remember it. So if they've forgotten how to do something, then I'll remember later for when I give them discipline. So the next thing I look for is, after I've done the review, is I give out discipline and rewards. So if they've done everything that I've asked, if I'm very pleased with what they've done, I will verbally reward them. I'll reward them primarily in their love language. If it's touch, then I'll give them a pat on the head or a little bit of a tickle, and let them know that I'm pleased with what they've done. Now, if they've gotten something wrong, depending on the severity of it and the number of times that they've done it, then they'll get some level of discipline, which matches with their checklist. Now, I'm not going to discipline them outside of their checklist for obvious reasons, but if it's something that is already in their checklist, they might get discipline for failing to do something like shave or, whatever it happens to be. The next thing I do is I do new training. So I build each time. It's a little bit of a building process. You don't start off with the most complicated. You start off with the simplest. And I'm going to touch on that in more detail. But one of the things that I do that some other dominants don't do is I make things as simple as possible. There's some very complicated words that honestly I can't even remember for the different positions. And so what I've done is I've taken all those complicated words away and I've replaced them with what makes sense for me and for the sub. Because when a sub is in subspace, it's very hard for her to remember things that are complicated. And if the words that you use to describe the positions actually are the position, then it makes it a lot easier for them. In any case, back to what I was saying. So they'll get new training on maybe new positions, verbal commands, whatever it is that you're teaching them and training them with. And then it's playtime. It's an opportunity to use all the different things that they've learned up until this point. Maybe it's preparation for bondage, and then some other things. It could be play in terms of discipline. It could be anything and everything that you've trained them to accept up until that point. But don't go beyond what they've already learned how to do and accept it, because that's not okay. Then once playtime is over, which could last for 20 minutes to hours, who knows, then it's aftercare. And it's important that you give them as much aftercare as they need. It's not based on time, it's based on the requirement. So if the intensity of the scene was low and they're back with you and they're totally focused again very quickly, then it can be a shorter scene, but make sure you actually ask them how they're doing in terms of their aftercare. Now, obviously, you can look at their body language and it'll be quite obvious when they're totally out of it. And then sometimes when they come out of it, they'll be asking you questions that are very complicated and complex, and you'll know that, hey, they've had enough aftercare. But it's important to give them as much aftercare as they need at the time, not waiting till later or not skipping out on it, because it will pay you dividends if you do what you need to do when it's required, not trying to fix a mistake after the fact. Okay, so after aftercare, the next day or maybe a few hours after, depending on the intensity of the scene, I go into debriefing, and I will remind the sub of everything that's occurred in the scene, because obviously if you've done a good job, they'll actually have mental gaps as to what's occurred. There'll be like a time shift where it feels like 20 minutes, even though 2 or 3 hours may have passed. So go through everything step by step. And it's not so much that you're getting feedback on how good you are. It's more to understand how the sub felt in different circumstances, how the intensity was. And you're not asking for permission. You're more getting a feedback on what your perception was and making sure that you both are on the same page and that was what she actually asked for and whatnot. Over time, these won't be so structured. I mean, you'll be able to do a debriefing by text or quickly by phone, because you will have the vast amount of knowledge about your sub. So it's only the new things will really have to be touched on, and also your sub will feel more comfortable with just telling you outright, like not having to have a formal debriefing session. I did touch on debriefing in a different lesson, but that's the anatomy of a scene. Now, having said all that, this is not how it has to be structured. This is just a default setting for how I would structure a scene. Just like a story or a great meal has a beginning, a middle, and an end, it should have a slow beginning, a great middle, and a slow, gentle end. So take that with you and be safe.